How do you assess the economic damages? What does this mean for Russia?
Well, look, Russia is actually quite a complicated country in terms of transportation. It's long. In geography, there's the concept of round countries where it's generally not very far to get from the center to any point. There are also long countries, and Russia is a long one. For Russia, the transportation system is extremely important. And the problem now is that Russian civil aviation is in crisis. Passenger transportation isn't coping very well either. Just recently, after the events of the last day at the airports, people rushed to the railways trying at least to get to St. Petersburg by train. Tickets were instantly sold out, and they're trying to urgently add extra train cars. I don't know how this will end, but overall, the country's transport connectivity is kind of falling apart. And these losses for Russian civil aviation are already quite an unpleasant issue. Russian civil aviation, to put it mildly, is not a very profitable sector. It's more often unprofitable. The point is that Russian aviation was set up in such a way that it made money primarily through various international connections. First of all, Aeroflot had a good income. All foreign companies flying through Russian airspace paid for it. Transport routes to Asia passed through Russia and accordingly back as well. And Aeroflot therefore received payment for the use of Russian airspace by planes making transit flights. Now, this is almost gone. If you look at an air traffic map on something like Flight Radar, you'll see that there are far fewer traces of planes in Russian airspace, and of course that income has disappeared. Next, Russian companies used to actively earn money by flying Russian tourists all over the world. But now Russian tourists have suddenly stopped traveling abroad. There's no need to say that some people are still going to Dubai or Egypt. Those flows are nothing like what they used to be. Even the demand for foreign currency in Russia has sharply decreased precisely because basically outbound tourism has practically died. Accordingly, airlines can't transport passengers. There used to be huge profits. During the summer, there was just a flood of charter flights that airlines made money on. Now that's gone. And domestic flights in Russia aren't very profitable. They're actually loss-making. And to this day, the Russian government subsidizes domestic flights so that Russians can travel around the country. Because if people can't travel around the country, then it's not really a country, right? In other words, there's no sense of being a unified country if you can't get anywhere. But right now, that's exactly the picture that's taking shape. No amount of money can solve the security problems at major Russian airports, so they're starting to go out of operation. This means huge losses for Russian airlines. I repeat, they're already in a difficult situation as it is. So what they're going to do next is unclear. Of course, they'll ask the government for subsidies, and that would be fair because it's the government that got them into this mess. It was the government that started the war, not the airline. Now the airlines are suffering, but I'm afraid they won't get any money because right now there's no money for anything except the war. And we're already seeing this line of sufferers going to the Ministry of Finance to ask for money, and they're being refused. For example, there was already a case. Right now, Russia's coal industry is in a huge crisis. To support it, they introduced reduced tariffs for coal transportation. But then the losses fell on Russian Railways, RZD. Russian Railways, RZD, came to the government, basically shouting, "Give us subsidies to cover the losses we're taking so that Russia's coal industry doesn't die off quickly." But they were told, "You weren't invited here," and no subsidies were given, and so on. So, in this sense, it will generally be difficult to close the gap in the airline industry economy. That's why I think we're going to see some very unpleasant developments related to the bankruptcy of Russian airlines and industry consolidation. And soon there may be only Aeroflot left in Russia. It seems the other airlines probably won't survive. But I think that's the situation.
Nikolai Vladimirovich, what about the lack of connectivity, the internet not working, YouTube? We've noticed that after the special operation Web, even Russian war correspondents report that not only major cities, but the entire territory of Russia is experiencing signal jamming and internet disruptions. This is how they are trying to counter special operations and Ukrainian intelligence services. How does this affect the lives of ordinary Russians?
Well, it means that Russians are being completely cut off from global civilization. This might seem like a strange topic, but right now I have acquaintances who went to Russia for a while to visit their parents, and they say in horror that they've ended up in some kind of, black zone. Nothing works, nothing is possible. We can't connect to the outside world at all. They say we try one VPN after another, and not a single VPN works. After the first connection, the second one is immediately detected. They diagnose the VPN, and then they stop working. So you end up, how can I put it, in a soundproof room. You just can't connect with the outside world in any way. You can't communicate with anyone. You can't work remotely. You're trapped inside Russia's information space. And honestly, it's a pretty terrifying situation. This has a significant impact. And, I noticed this quite clearly. My YouTube views have dropped because many Russians simply can't watch. Now I've switched, to recording all my streams. I've also made audio files and set up a special audio channel on Telegram so that people can at least listen to my interviews, including yours, which will be available in audio format. At least with Telegram, people can still listen directly, but they can't watch anymore. In other words, people are being cut off from gaming sites. As you can see, people are being cut off from WhatsApp, from Telegram. People are gradually being cut off from YouTube as well. So basically, it's becoming a closed system. I would say that an informational concentration camp is being formed. Russians used to claim that the war didn't affect them in any way, that it was happening somewhere far away, on the outskirts. This so-called special military operation has nothing to do with us at all. But now the war has reached them quite directly, through cancelled flights and the disappearance of the ability to live in the information space. Well, as they say, you reap what you sow.
Dear audience, Igor Vladimirovich has just asked a question. We're interested in the geography of our viewers. Where are you watching us from? Write in the comments where you're watching from, your city and country. Are you watching us through a VPN or not? Write a few kind words in support of Ukraine. How is your connection? Because we work for an audience all over the world so that people know the truth about Russian aggression and Russia's war against Ukraine. That's why every like, every comment and every subscription from you means that you are on the side of light. Igor Vladimirovich, regarding an important topic, the attacks on airfields from both an economic and military perspective. How much does it actually cost to restore infrastructure after a strike in Engels, in Borisoglebsk, after strikes on key military strategic airfields during Operation Web? And how do such strikes on strategic aviation affect the military budget and Russia's ability to keep fighting for years to come?
Well, look, the situation is interesting. There was a report that Russia is trying to expand its plant for producing strategic bombers. Well, because up until now, Russian aviation has, in general, lost this capability. Well, how should I put it? Once, Russia was a very great, powerful, and renowned aviation power. There were quite good designers, and there were good combat aircraft, and we remember this situation. I still remember from my childhood all those stories about intense dogfights in the skies over Korea and Vietnam, where Soviet pilots, disguising themselves as Vietnamese, fought against American pilots. Back then, it was quite an even war, quite significant. And back then, it seemed that Russian aviation would always be a very powerful industry. But then the collapse happened somewhere in the 1990s. And in general, the Russian aviation industry has not recovered from that collapse. And now it has found itself in a kind of trouble. Because as they say, they're just squeezing out the last flight hours from old aircraft. It's difficult to build new planes, including military aircraft, because there simply aren't the resources. Well, how should I put it? A great deal has been lost. It's not a very fast or obvious process to people, the process of degradation. When you mention it, people are surprised. What do you mean degradation? But after all, people are still doing things, you know. And when the older generation starts to leave, it's important that a new generation of designers, engineers, technologists, and skilled workers comes in to take over the production capabilities. Then the industry survives. But in Russia, this is a complete disaster because there are neither engineering nor labor personnel at all. And this isn't something I'm just making up. Look, Kemezov, the head of Rostec, stated this quite clearly just recently. He said that basically there is a huge shortage of personnel for the military industry in Russia. And what will come of this, we don't know. So far, all this talk about reproducing and once again building strategic bombers and so on is a complicated story because the industry needs to be capable of doing it. But there is no such sense because we see a simple picture. For example, nothing is working out in civil aviation. Russia cannot launch new airplanes, and it desperately needs new planes. They start some projects like the MS-21, try to make a new Tu aircraft, and some regional planes like the Baikal. Nothing is working out. So much has been destroyed, so much has been lost, that it's extremely difficult to restore. And even the combat aircraft that Russia had, like the Su series, are already starting to fall behind. Well, simply because the electronics are outdated and they don't have their own electronics. So, of course, these losses are practically irrecoverable because Russia's industrial capabilities now simply don't allow for this to be restored so easily. They can produce the simplest types of weapons like ammunition, and they've learned to make some basic drones, but when it comes to something very complex, it seems they're no longer really able to restore that. And at this point, even money won't help. You see, it's not about lacking the money to restore, say, the fleet of strategic bombers. They can provide the money, but actually making it happen is no longer possible.
Igor Vladimirovich, regarding the fleet and the tankers, so we understand that there have been strikes on bases in Novorossiysk, in the Far East, and in St. Petersburg as well. There was also an incident with a tanker. From an economic standpoint, are the losses at the naval bases in Novorossiysk and the Far East an apocalypse for raw material exports and logistics chains?
Overall, the situation with maritime exports is becoming very complicated. I can't say it's a catastrophe yet, but the situation is getting bad. Several problems have started to emerge. The first problem is that European countries have finally decided to start inspecting Russian ships. In fact, this has been discussed, since around February or March of last year. At that time, I also wrote about this, that in general, there was a certain directive from the European Union, or maybe not a directive, that's a strong word, but a recommendation from the EU to Denmark to impose strict control over the passage of tankers carrying Russian oil through the Danish Strait. Well, in general, the Danes were quite puzzled and stunned at the time and showed no readiness to act. They said that it would be very difficult for them to do this. In reality, though, it is quite possible to complicate the passage of these ships if there is the will to do so. As you can see, this scenario is now starting to play out. NATO ships are planning to inspect these vessels, the ships transporting Russian oil, to check whether they meet the requirements for this kind of navigation in the Baltic, insurance, and so on. So, if the insurance requirements are not met, the ships will automatically be put on a blacklist. That is, even without any special decisions from NATO, the EU, or the US. And then they will be under sanctions, and there will be major problems for them. That's why there's a threat that a very large share of the shadow fleet that Russia has created will simply become inoperable. We've already heard some figures, but of course it's difficult to verify all this because you have to understand we're talking about things that aren't very obvious and are quite secretive. Only some indirect estimates appear. That's what I'm relying on. Up to 400 ships are already on this blacklist, and they are already being refused service. And accordingly, these vessels are basically docked, laid up, anchored, moored, however you want to put it, but they're not sailing yet. So if this list is expanded now, Russia will face major problems. And if they also manage to push through the idea of lowering the price cap to 45, which is part of the 18th package, then there will be even greater difficulty. Russian maritime exports will fall even further. Combined with the low price of oil, this is a very serious blow to Russia's financial situation, to the Russian budget, and to spending on Russian life. This, of course, is a path that leads to an extremely serious crisis situation in the Russian economy.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
Igor Vladimirovich, you brought up a very important topic. Yes, this includes the shadow fleet, the 18th package of sanctions, and the position of the United States. As for the $30 price, that's not even being discussed at this point. But as for the shadow fleet, which Europe still isn't fighting against, just recently Chancellor Grema appeared in Merz and said that Grema would be strengthening control over the shadow fleet in the Baltic Sea.
As you know, at the moment, only Slovakia and Hungary are blocking it. But the European Union in this regard is starting to learn something and is working out methods to circumvent these obstacles. Blockades from Hungary and Slovakia, because they are always against it. They are practically a fifth column within the European Union. I don't understand how the European Union can continue to put up with this, but that's their problem. Therefore, of course, there may be some solutions and they might still manage to implement this price cap. And that would already be significant because, well, as they say, America is far away, but here, they're coming right around Europe, aren't they? They leave from Ust-Luga and go around Europe. And accordingly, if not a single European port will service them, they will have quite serious problems. And the US doesn't even benefit from this. You mentioned the word benefit. No, the US doesn't gain anything from Russia exporting oil. But there are some idiotic concepts from Trump, like not quarreling with Putin so that at some point he'll come to his senses and eventually agree to end the war. That's a rather strange concept. But Trump had these dreams of resolving this conflict quickly and to get the Nobel Prize for it, which he still can't quite bring himself to give up on. He's even starting to grumble that Putin isn't living up to his expectations, but nevertheless, he still doesn't want to impose a sanctions regime against Russia. He hopes that Putin will eventually come to his senses and for his own benefit will back down. Of course, that's an illusion. It's not going to happen. But unfortunately, what you're saying means a very simple thing. By the way, this has already been voiced by the leadership of the European Union. They said that we have to understand that the West, as we used to know it, no longer exists. In other words, this unified bloc of countries that was ready to somehow contain Russia's aggression no longer exists. There is the European Union as a separate entity. There is Europe as a whole, meaning a collection of states both inside and outside the EU. And there is the United States as a separate territory. This is the reality we are living in now.
Ignacy Vladimirovich, but still, if we model the situation where the European Union decides to vote for the 18th package of sanctions, how feasible will this be in practice, considering the shadow fleet and the position of the United States? You are absolutely right to point out that from an economic standpoint, America's position is unclear. I also talk to economists, and they say that Trump's logic is incomprehensible. This is purely a political decision.
Of course, but look, you have to understand that the price cap is still at 60. Russian oil, well, for now, you see all the numbers I mentioned are very indirect. We live in a country that has classified all statistics, so it's very difficult. But still, apparently, Russian exports are now going at a price of about 52 to 53, which is below the cap. And that means Greek ships are transporting the oil. Greek ship owners are making money. They always try to help out and earn for themselves at the same time. They've made money off Russia more than once. They started by transporting oil. In 2022, they were extremely active. Before the price cap was introduced, they made huge amounts of money. Then they sold their old tankers to Russia. And as I understand it, this entire so-called shadow fleet consists of former Greek tankers, just the ones that were due to be written off. So look, the point is that Russia's shadow fleet consists of old rust buckets. That's what they're called. Because you see, an oil tanker is supposed to be operated for 12 to 15 years. And after that, it becomes dangerous, starts to rust, and all sorts of other nasty problems begin to happen with it. And usually they're sent off to be scrapped for metal. But the Greeks managed to sell their old junk to Russia for quite a lot of money, billions, in fact. And now these shadow ships of the Russian fleet are tankers that are 25 to 30 years old. They're dangerous. They're an environmental hazard, which is why Europe is starting to get nervous, even though Europe is generally rather slow and indecisive. But everyone understands that if there are any major spills, all the countries around the Baltic in Europe will be in serious trouble. So at least there is some movement happening. We'll see what comes of it, because Russia has also started deploying warships to escort these tankers. This is, of course, a very interesting situation because these ships aren't sailing under Russian flags. It's one thing if I'm escorting a ship that's sailing under the Russian flag. But if it's some Liberian ship and for some reason I'm protecting it, then an interesting question arises. Why are you guarding a Liberian ship? What are you doing that for? What's in it for you? So, of course, there could be some very unpleasant naval conflicts here. Let's see how it all ends. But the very fact that NATO ships have started to go out and inspect these oil tankers is, of course, quite an interesting development. Proper management. So if the price cap is set at 45, the Greeks will stop transporting. They're afraid of this because, after all, nobody wants to end up under sanctions. The ship that falls under sanctions can practically no longer operate. Even if it carries other cargo, once it's under sanctions, it's practically lost. But no one wants to lose their assets. So if the cap is set at 45 now, the Greeks will again stop transporting Russian oil. And that would be a very big blow to the Russian oil and gas sector.
And accordingly, this will affect budget revenues as well. As for the American sanctions, the 500% tariffs look like an unrealistic scenario. But Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham, do you think they could lower it, make it 20%, 50%, 100%? And what about secondary sanctions on countries that buy Russian gas, oil, petroleum products, and raw materials like China and India? What if they simply stop doing it? What do you think? Well, first of all, let's see in what form the bill will be passed.
Well, because bills change. For example, they just passed the big, beautiful bill, and some things were dropped from it as well. There were a few rather outrageous provisions that were removed during the approval process because they were just completely insane. And in the end, they were thrown out because, well, European countries made it clear to the US that if this were adopted, the response would be so strong, it would be hard to handle. And in this sense, the US would face very strong retaliatory sanctions. And it would be better if these provisions were not adopted. For example, one of the sections, I think it was the 899th, was simply removed. So let's see in what form the big, beautiful bill is adopted. And now let's see how Lindsey Graham's bill will be passed. I'll put it this way. I paid attention to Graham's words after he played golf. Just think about how absurd our lives have become. We're discussing politicians' statements after they play golf with the President of the United States. This is a kind of a debased system of politics, but here we are, forced to live in this vulgar political world. It's absolutely disgusting. So he said something like, we had a talk with the president, at least he didn't use the word chatted. And that's basically how they operate. And by the way, Trump's vocabulary is pretty much the same, like street thugs. So we had a talk with the president, and our task is to speed up the adoption of the bill in order to arm the president with this legislation. So if we translate this into concrete terms, it means that this bill started out as a direct action bill, introducing 500% tariffs for countries buying Russian energy resources, but most likely it will be passed as a secondary action law, granting the US president the right to impose such tariffs. And whether he imposes them or not, well, just look at Trump, how he imposes things. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. So I would say that Lindsey Graham's bill was a big swing, but in reality, it could end up being a completely meaningless piece of paper.
Igor Vladimirovich, regarding inflation and poverty, and in general the risk of social unrest, we see conflicts around us involving minorities, and this may even be connected to the construction sector. I spoke with an economist, and he said that the worse the Russian economy performs, the more representatives of ethnic minorities will form their own power blocks and there will be certain military or paramilitary conflicts. That's how tactfully he put it. Regarding inflation and poverty, is there a risk of a new wave of poverty and social unrest within Russia? I'm interested in your opinion.
The risk of poverty is high. I should have an article coming out in the next few days. Maybe it even came out today. I haven't checked yet, in Republic, where I discuss this. So Putin declared at the St. Petersburg Forum that Russia is entering an era of high-wage economics. Incredibly beautiful words. Absolutely false, absolutely meaningless, but beautifully said. You see, he's a real master of political demagoguery. In reality, Russia is entering a period of declining living standards because wage growth in Russia has stopped while the cost of living is rising. This year, we're seeing a serious increase, maybe not the very first, but certainly the first really significant one, and there will probably be more to come. But the first and most significant one is the increase in utility tariffs. Right now, I'm receiving letters from people all over the country about how much their rates have increased. I think the record was in the Omsk region, 40%. Today, I got another message about a 29% increase in tariffs somewhere else. This is, of course, a very serious blow because far from everyone has seen their salaries grow in recent years. Many public sector workers receive such meager compensation for inflation that they've been getting poorer for a long time now, and already they don't understand how they're going to survive. That's why, of course, Russia is now entering a period of impoverishment, and many who used to be middle class are becoming poor. They write to me too, saying that they used to feel like they were solidly middle class. At the very least, we could afford all the goods necessary for a normal family life. Once a year, we would go abroad to a resort for vacation and everything was great. But now we can't even go to regular stores or supermarkets anymore. We have to shop at the cheapest, most bare-bones supermarket, like Svetofor or Pobeda, where the prices are dirt cheap, but the quality of the products is completely questionable. You don't even know if you'll survive or not. Well, that's basically the picture. In other words, we suddenly became poor. We stopped being middle class. We became poor. But this situation is only going to get worse because most likely there will be even more budget cuts and people will start to suffer from it. Maybe then the trend that's already formed will become even more obvious and pronounced. These are delays in wage payments. A very unpleasant topic for Russians. But that happy chapter, so to speak, for the country has already ended, and now the unhappy one has begun. And Gref has already spoken about this. He said that they are receiving quite a lot of requests from individuals who took out loans from Sberbank asking for a deferral on their loan repayment. And in a quarter of the cases, this is simply because wages are not being paid. We would pay off the loan, but our salaries haven't been paid. There's nothing to pay with. So you see, this trend has already taken shape at the level of Sberbank. Non-payments are on the rise. Now, utility rates have gone up, and already 1 in 5 Russians, that means there is 1 trillion rubles in unpaid utility bills. And now it's quite difficult to pay this off because, generally speaking, people no longer have such earnings. And as you understand, penalties keep accumulating as well. That's why the penalties are calculated at the central bank's interest rate. There are a lot of different approaches to this. So in this sense, people are in debt and in trouble. They'll have their electricity cut off. And their gas will be cut off too. And Russian cities will start turning into, how should I put it, into places that are not really civilized to live in. This will lead to people trying to find ways to cope. When I said a year and a half ago that people should start thinking about getting wood stoves for their homes, everyone laughed at my words. They said, what is this professor talking about? What wood stoves in apartment buildings? How are you supposed to haul firewood up to the top floor? But now, of course, this is becoming very relevant. For now, people have started bringing gas cylinders into their apartments, and that's why explosions have started happening in apartments, because people don't really know how to handle this gas properly. They brought in gas stoves, brought gas cylinders, and basically they're trying somehow, apparently the gas was shut off. They're trying to save money, to survive somehow. But all of this ends in explosion. Recently, there were 3 explosions in just one day. Household gas exploded, the cylinders blew up. How did a gas cylinder end up in an apartment building? But the building is already connected to the gas supply. So where did the cylinder come from? It means they're replacing it. This is the kind of thing that's going to keep happening. And Russian cities will, well, how should I put it, turn into ghettos for the poor. Well, will these events cause some kind of social discontent? Probably, but it will be very localized. It will be some kind of outrage against the mayor, at most against the governors, but it won't escalate into any serious social unrest. Well, maybe eventually it will quietly lead to road blockade. That's when other kinds of events will start to happen. So keep an eye out for when people in Russia start blocking railways and federal highways. That's when it will be clear that Russia is slowly starting to boil over. For now, we don't see that happening.
Igor Vladimirovich, the final topic I wanted to discuss with you today. We see that partly because of Trump's policies, Putin has started using drone and missile terror. Our military command says that in the future, it could be 1,000 drones per day. And this will happen regularly, several times a week, maybe even more. In general, Putin is ramping up production. And here I'd like to ask you, from an economic and military perspective, how much longer can the military machine continue this terror against Ukraine and even scale it up?
So scaling up is probably not very likely, but continuing is possible because, of course, notice that Putin said Russia is already excessively burdened by military spending and that military expenses need to be reduced. He said this in Minsk, but I don't think they will cut all military spending to the maximum. They will reduce spending on the production of those types of weapons that are not very effective. For example, it's unlikely that new Russian tanks will be produced. This weapon hasn't proven itself very well. Russian tanks, no Armata, as you can see, has appeared on the battlefield, even though there were claims that it was a terrifying tank that would guarantee victory for the Russian army and that everything would be accomplished instantly. None of that happened. But they are producing drones, they are ramping up the production of this kind of simple equipment, they are sourcing some electronics through China, and this will continue. As long as Russia doesn't collapse, Russia will keep producing a lot of weapons, and you'll have to fight against that. In this sense, even very poor territories are capable of producing weapons. Just look at the Palestinians in Israel. The Palestinians have destroyed their own economy. Their population lives in poverty, but they still manage to produce all sorts of nasty, vile military means and periodically try to launch them. What does Israel do? It creates the Iron Dome. It develops lasers to shoot them down. I think Ukraine has only one option: to keep developing increasingly powerful air defense systems and destroy as many launched weapons as possible. To assume that Russia will suddenly weaken and stop producing them, I wouldn't count on that for now.
Dear audience, please like this video. Write a few kind words in support of Ukraine in the comments. Subscribe to Igor Lindsay's YouTube channel. It's very important. The link will be in the description. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, Dasha Schastlivaya. We work for an audience all over the world so that people know the truth about Russian aggression, about Russia's war against Crimea. Today we discuss the war economy and the ability of the Russian war machine to wage war. Next, with a well-known economist, a professor. See you next time. Thank you.
All right, take care. Goodbye.